Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Water in the Native World webinar series. This is the first webinar of 5. My name is Dr. Carletta Chief, and I'm an associate professor and extension specialist in environmental science at the University of Arizona. I'm also from the Navajo Nation, and as an extension specialist in hydrology, I work to bridge relevant science to Native American communities in a culturally sensitive manner by providing hydrology expertise, transferring knowledge, assessing information needs, and developing applied science projects. This webinar series features papers in Water in the Native World, a special issue that I was the guest editor for. Papers are about water challenges facing tribal communities, where Indigenous scientists and community members and students who are Indigenous led and were involved in addressing these challenges. You can download the special issue at ucowr.org. That is UCOWR.org, which stands for University Council on Water Resources. This webinar is supported by the University of Arizona NIEHS Superfund Research Program, focusing on risk and remediation of metal mining waste, and the U of A NSF NRT grant, training grant, Indigenous Food, Energy, Water, Security, and Sovereignty grant. This April 2020 special issue in the Journal of Contemporary Water Research and Education was born through an NSF workshop grant that I had with colleagues to develop a network of individuals working on tribal water challenges. So we sought out water research on tribal lands and those facing tribes related to hydrology, water resources, water quality, climate change, water rights, cultural values, among others. The special issue has 7 papers, and they cover surface and groundwater challenges facing tribes in the Southwest, Montana, and Michigan. The first paper in this special issue is entitled A Confluence of Anticolonial Pathways for Indigenous Sacred Site Protection by Ellis and Perry. This paper is a prime example of the need to have Indigenous perspectives in the discourse of water management and policy, especially when Indigenous perspectives on water use and water rights and water conservations are so different from Western perspectives. Ellis and Perry discussed the challenges facing the Hopi tribe in advocating for the protection of a sacred site, Sipapuni, while trying to do that in the Western paradigm of water rights litigation and cultural resource management. So I'm really excited to introduce the 2 presenters and authors of this paper, Rachel Ellis and Denielle Perry. Rachel Ellis is an educator, advocate, and researcher specializing in justice-oriented watershed management and conservation in the Southwest. Dr. Denielle Perry is a water resources geography specializing in river conservation. She's an assistant professor in the School of Earth and Sustainability at Northern Arizona University. I encourage you to go to the special issue. Please share it. It's free to download, and join us for our next webinar, our second one, which will be June 17th at 2 p.m. And at this time, I'm happy and excited to turn over to Rachel Ellis and Denielle Perry. Thank you.
Thank you, Carletta, and welcome everybody. This is Denielle Perry. I'm calling in. I'm glad that you're all able to join us today for this first part of the webinar series. And I just want to give a little introduction to the work that Rachel and I have been conducting over the last couple years before Rachel takes over with the presentation. So I met Vernon Masayespa at the Water in the Native World Symposium in August of 2018 in Montana. And this Hopi elder asked me if I would help him conduct research for protection strategies that could be used to protect the sacred Sipapuni. And this conversation is what led to the research that you're about to learn more about here in this presentation. And Rachel Ellis, I had the privilege of working with her as her advisor through her thesis project at NAU, which resulted in this study. While we are not Indigenous, we are both dedicated to supporting efforts for the re-Indigenization of water across the Americas, especially here in the Southwest. So today, as the Little Colorado River and Sipapuni face increasing threats, collaboration between Indigenous water protectors, scholars, and advocates are all the more important. So please feel free to ask us any questions at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Danielle. And thank you, Carletta, and for organizing and editing this special issue, and then all the organizers for the webinar. It's really an honor to be here. So I'm going to jump in. You might notice I'm looking the other direction, but that's because my notes are on the other screen. So here we go. So today I'm going to talk about the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers in the Grand Canyon, which is pictured here. The confluence is sacred to 7 tribes: Hopi, Zuni, Dene, Havasupai, Southern Paiute, Apache, and Wallapai. And the confluence has been under consistent threat for years, from dams in Marble Canyon to trams. And you may have read recent headlines for new proposals to build 4 dams on the Little Colorado River, or LCR, as I will refer to it, to facilitate hydroelectric energy schemes. These 2 proposals just received initial approval to conduct feasibility studies as of May 21st. Of this year. And on June 2nd of this year, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission accepted a 3rd preliminary permit application to dam Big Canyon, which is a tributary to the LCR. And this is proposed as a replacement to the previous 2 projects. The Big Canyon proposal would pump groundwater to fill and refill the project's reservoirs. And the groundwater for that would, of course, come from the same sources that supply a variety of sacred spring water in the LCR Gorge. So I also want to quickly acknowledge Grand Canyon Trust for the use of these great maps. And again, these are just examples of the most recent threats in a long, long history of threats in the watershed. Generally, substantial surface and groundwater use in the broader LCR watershed threatens the water sources of the confluence and also springs in the basin. All of this is highly problematic for tribes in the region, and particularly for the Hopi, because their Sipapuni is near the confluence of the Colorado River and the Little Colorado River, which you can see here kind of on the left side of your screen. Sipapu or Sipapuni, which the difference just depends on which Hopi Mesa one is from, is a travertine spring generally understood as the Hopi place of emergence into the current world, and it is fundamental for cultural renewal. As Danielle mentioned, our research engaged with Black Mesa Trust, which is a Hopi nonprofit, and we also worked to a lesser extent with Dene-led Save the Confluence, both of whom are concerned with the confluence area. Black Mesa Trust is led by Hopi Elder Vernon Masayespa, and the primary concern driving our research is summed up in his words about the death of Sipapuni, which are the concerns Hopi elders are voicing to him. So overall, the ultimate purpose was to help local Indigenous water protectors with whom I had a relationship, federal land managers, and the public understand why this important region needs better protection and how that can be accomplished. So we asked, can federal policies be employed in anti-colonial pursuit of water and sacred site protection? And how do Indigenous grassroots organizers envision protection and work to re-Indigenize water management? We essentially took a comparative approach between these two pathways towards protection. Semi-structured interviews with Indigenous community organizers, federal land managers, and cultural and water resource experts were coupled with policy and law analyses of the National Historic Preservation Act and the ongoing LCR adjudication. The research is really a case study to demonstrate how to pursue both federal governance and grassroots analysis through community-based and community-accountable research structures. A lot of activity, including relationship building, sharing back research, strategizing, and teaching, ran simultaneously alongside the research. So just to ensure that we're oriented, I'll get my mouse over there. Here we go. The physical confluence overlaps Grand Canyon National Park and Navajo Nation. So this is kind of a zoomed out view of what we were just looking at, which is right here. This is the Colorado River coming in, and this is the Little Colorado River coming in. So this is confluence area. The green is Grand Canyon National Park. The lighter tan is Navajo Nation, and this darker tan is the Hopi Reservation. So Sipapuni is technically on Navajo Nation land, and the multi-jurisdictional nature of the area really complicates protective measures. For now, neither the park nor Navajo Nation offer comprehensive protection for the confluence with regard to cultural sites and their attendant water. The purple line is the boundary of the watershed, the Little Colorado River watershed here. And the river itself flows northwest, so the headwaters are up here and it's flowing this direction. It was formerly perennial in its entirety, and it's now intermittent due to impoundments, diversions, falling groundwater levels. The majority of groundwater flows in the same direction as the surface water. So groundwater generally flows down this way toward the river and then off of Black Mesa and discharges down in the lower gorge area. Okay, this mouse situation. There we go. Overall, the threats we focused on stem ultimately from colonization. In Arizona, as in many places, colonial acts of territorialization created and recreated reservation boundaries, constricting, changing, and outright destroying access to homelands and sacred sites. But colonization is, of course, not only a thing of the past. Colonization drives water, mineral, and other resource extraction, and it fuels industrialization, degrading water, plant, animal, and human health disproportionately on Indigenous lands. Colonization in the name of conservation also created national parks and other federal land management boundaries, which is the green we see here, dispossessing Indigenous people from their land for the strange concept of a wilderness untrammeled by humans. And finally, as we'll see, colonial mentalities reveal themselves in the dominance of Western ways of knowing and governance. So more specifically, the primary two threats to the confluence in Sipapu that we focused on are first, court decisions denying Hopi rights to the LCR, and second, groundwater withdrawal. For the first specific threat in the ongoing LCR adjudication, which is the court process to determine primarily surface water rights in the LCR basin. As it currently stands, the court determined that the Hopi, because their reservation is not adjacent to the LCR, which you can see here, the current boundaries of the Hopi reservation don't abut the main stem of the LCR, that the Hopi do not have rights to the river. And so, said another way, the Hopi, who are the oldest living water users in the area, have been denied rights to the LCR based on reservation boundaries. And this denial rejects all indigenous knowledges and anthropological evidence of Hopi homelands. This map shows the extent of Hopi Aboriginal lands and their clear presence near the LCR. And so just to explain this a little bit, the darker blue, let me get my mouse over there. Darker blue, of course, is current boundaries for Hopi, and the tan and the orange are current boundaries for Navajo Nation. But Aboriginal territories for Hopi really include this whole tan area and the teal area, which the LCR runs right through the middle of. Okay. So if Hopi do not have any legal right to water in the LCR, the concern is that they will not have a place at the decision-making table as the waters of the LCR continue to run dry. And concerning the second threat, the historical groundwater use by Choya, Coronado, and Springerville generating stations, which are in the LCR headwaters, have caused groundwater levels to decline as much as 100 feet near the generating station. And their combined withdrawal amounts to 7 times the water use by Flagstaff, which is a city of over 70,000 people, and it's 36 times the water consumption on Hopi. There are really significant Western science data gaps in understanding how groundwater functions in the LCR, and thus how impacts to aquifers in the broader basin impact faraway springs such as Sipapuni. However, it's well established that groundwater pumping by Peabody Western Coal Company mines, such as Kayenta up north, have significantly decreased aquifer levels and spring discharge in the Black Mesa region, which is generally here. So the future of the watershed is concerning. The Arizona Department of Water Resources projects municipal and industrial groundwater use in the headwater area to greatly increase to between 100,000 and 155,000 acre feet by 2060. Again, that is all groundwater. But the main mechanism for groundwater management in Arizona, which is the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, effectively doesn't address the LCR basin at all. The act does regulate groundwater withdrawal in active management areas like Phoenix, which is kind of off the map over here to the southwest. And which Phoenix uses Central Arizona Project water to reduce its groundwater reliance. And for those of you who don't know, the Central Arizona Project is an aqueduct that pumps Colorado River water uphill hundreds of miles to Phoenix and Tucson. And so the link is that the Central Arizona Project, until very recently, was powered by the Navajo generating station, which I don't know if you guys can see that or not, if the Zoom is blocking it, but it's up here on the northern end of this map. So Navajo generating station powered Central Arizona Project, and NGS got its coal from Kayenta until last fall. And Kayenta pulled water from the Navajo aquifer on indigenous land under Black Mesa. And the point generally here is that access to cheap water and power in Arizona, Nevada, and California has really been subsidized from the health of indigenous peoples and their waters, which is of course a story that repeats around the world. So I just wanted to give some very brief context for this research. So we understood that any exploration of how to protect the confluence must examine if and how such efforts address colonial impacts. We engaged a critical and anti-colonial theoretical lens to help us analyze a spectrum of strategies. Critical Indigenous research methodologies also provided a guiding framework, which we have hoped to honor in our research through being accountable to the 4 R's here. And these principles guide research in ways that ensure that the fundamental questions of whose research is it, who owns it, and whose interest does it serve are answered in ways that center Indigenous people's concerns and are based in the community. Taken together, these frameworks help build not just a resistance to colonial impacts, but a restoration of what some refer to as re-Indigenizing and Indigenous knowledges approaches to relationships with water and land. So themes emerged from interviews that revealed how impacts of colonization make it incredibly difficult to protect water in the Little Colorado River Basin. These interview insights also really helped us be critical in our policy analyses later. So kind of to walk through these, Western policies are predicated on concrete, bounded definitions of resources, which is in contrast generally to holistic views of resources reflected by Indigenous interviewees. For instance, the very definition of the confluence spatially is quite variable. Decision-making in management and in courts is dominated by Western worldviews, particularly Western science. And whether water is thought of as living, kin, or as property changes how it is treated, and this is particularly evident in the adjudication. The complicated history of reservation creation and partitioning and repartitioning of lands between Hopi and Dene has created tensions over water resource protection in the LCR. And there are longstanding and difficult hurdles in the ways that colonial governance structures have been imposed, sometimes referred to as neocolonialism, through the Hopi Tribal Council and the lack of representation of Hopi traditionalists and religious leaders. And finally, of course, the unregulated extraction of groundwater, which is really driven by colonial industrial interests. So I also wanted to discuss more thematic findings. I'm afraid the screen is being cut off on the top here by Zoom. Hopefully y'all can see it though. So I want to discuss these thematic findings to underscore the complexity of the problem. There are fundamental worldview differences in how the threat to Sipapu are understood. Western science simplistically would ask, can it be proven that groundwater withdrawal is causing Sipapu's diminishment? And as far as I know, the impacts of groundwater withdrawal, especially from the headwater areas, and its relationship to Sipapu have never been explicitly studied by Western science. In conversations with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, they reflected that the current Hopi monitoring protocol in place does not monitor Sipapu water levels, so there is little baseline data. There is potential utility in implementing monitoring, and that's something we're working with them alongside the Grand Canyon Trust and Grand Canyon hydrologists to explore a culturally appropriate monitoring protocol. There's also photographic evidence from the 1960s that shows a change in diminishment in water flowing out of the top of the Sipapu spring, likely because of undercutting from a large flood. So I'm not able, and it's arguably not my role, to confirm the cause of Sipapuni's diminishment. Even if Sipapuni is being undercut by natural flood regimes, the concerns about water use and Hopi water rights in the broader basin remain valid. So, in other words, Concerns about Sipapuni's death can be understood literally, that is, its physical state, and as Indigenous knowledge or culturally informed concern about the holistic health of Sipapu and the broader watershed. And I think in both views, the need for water protection and for Hopi rights remains the same. So in these ways, Sipapuni can be understood as the hydrologic and spiritual nexus of watershed scale concerns. So moving forward, emergent protection strategies that surfaced in interviews build what we called anti-colonial pathways, and broadly emphases on relationships, responsibility, respect, reciprocity, accountability, and centering Indigenous ways of knowing are consistent with the literature on re-Indigenizing and Indigenous knowledges. Prioritizing relationships and connection can really be seen as a distinct anti-colonial strategy, since colonization's fundamental goal is the disconnection of Indigenous people in place. All interviewees discuss the centrality of relationships. This includes building coalitions of grassroots groups, environmental organizations, and land managers to resist what are really the most destructive modern colonizers, which are extractive industries. And advocating for the validity of Indigenous knowledges is equal to Western science, and better anti-colonial training for land managers were consistent themes. In any decision-making arenas, whether policy-making or in the courts, Indigenous people must have a meaningful seat at the table. And even though there is contradiction and tension here, a consistent pathway was calling upon the federal trust responsibility for a permanent homeland. And the last two strategies, anti-colonial pathways strategies, is that interviewees recognize that Indigenous rights to land and water are inherent, while understanding that advocacy strategies must simultaneously utilize what one interviewee called, quote, the tools at hand, such as the National Historic Preservation Act. And as we get into the policy analyses, it's apparent that there really has to be this strategic adaptation of colonial policies to achieve anti-colonial protections. And finally, land repatriation has to be considered. The fact that Hopi don't have jurisdiction over their most fundamentally sacred site was expressed by all Hopi interviewees as disturbing and unjust. And so overall, there's a constant negotiation at work here, which is a reimagining of better pathways and a pragmatism of using at what's currently at hand to protect sacred sites. Okay, there's a lot on this slide here. If it's cut off, what it says on the top is the National Historic Preservation Act and Traditional Cultural Place designation. So one of the tools at hand, one of the policies that we looked at, which the ones we're focusing on here were really chosen based on Indigenous suggestions and concerns that surfaced in interviews. So there's a lot of options here, but the ones we're focusing on came kind of from that community base at the time. And again, while it is maybe incongruous to assess anti-colonial dimensions of federal policy tools, we really think this critique is needed generally as a component of any protection strategy. So looking at the National Historic Preservation Act, and specifically a sub-designation within it called Traditional Cultural Property or Place, or TCP as I will refer to it. So TCP designations are often employed by tribes to protect sacred sites and may help protect Sipapu. And some of the good things about TCP designation is that it significantly broadens the definition of historic property types beyond human-made structures. So TCPs can be rivers, mountains, grasslands, landscapes. So it's very broad. And the value of TCP designation for the Confluence area and or specific sites within it is an assurance that they will have protection from federal actions. The TCP process helps tribes document cultural information in culturally sensitive ways and provides documentation to prove the need for protection to outside entities. And then kind of moving to the right-hand column, a more critical analysis of the NHPA would say, well, it doesn't guarantee protection of sites. What it guarantees is a mandate of it mandates a review process for federal agency undertakings. And for the Confluence region, this primarily concerns actions by the Bureau of Reclamation and USGS. And so we looked at how this policy is specifically being implemented right now in the BOR's Historic Preservation Plan, which came out in the fall of 2018. And so TCPs are really prevalent throughout the Grand Canyon. In fact, the Grand Canyon from the dam to the western boundary of the park and rim to rim, and inclusive of the lower LCR Gorge, is already considered a TCP in that historic preservation plan. Sipapu itself, the spring site itself, is considered eligible as a TCP. And so technically it does have protection as a TCP, as limited as that is. But neither the Historic Preservation Act or TCP status really address broader watershed concerns. So kind of where we landed was that at best, the National Historic Preservation Act protects sites from federal actions and can be used in the layering of other policies. And at worst, TCP is a kind of tokenism and detraction from future protection efforts because a site has ostensibly already been protected. And there we go. Okay. So looking at another pathway that we went down more in a water law analyses was looking at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And because of the denial of Hopi to rights in the LCR, we initially examined the LCR adjudication to understand whether the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a viable appeal strategy for Hopi water rights. And the reason for that is that the treaty has been used quasi-successfully for some Pueblos' water rights in New Mexico. And so the basic idea is that because the Hopi never signed a treaty with the United States, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which precedes that, and ceded much of present-day Arizona from Mexico to the US, it carried with it Spanish land and water rights for Pueblos, both for Hopi and Pueblos in New Mexico. The potential that it might still be applicable. And so not only was the treaty a much earlier priority water rights date than the 1882 executive order that created the Hopi reservation, the boundaries of the Hopi territory were much larger and were adjacent to the LCR. And I just put this there. This is just a rough approximation of the land that was ceded in the treaty to the US, if you're not familiar. So what we found is ultimately the court, and I just want to clarify, this LCR adjudication is, well, started in the 70s, but it's ongoing. Like, the decisions about Hopi water rights have only really been solidified within the last year. So this was ongoing as we were doing the research. It's very current. And so the court said the Hopi tribe does not hold water rights with a priority date of 1848 as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But what we found in our research is that there is credibility to the argument that Hopi retained senior land and water rights given under the treaty with what's known as a time immemorial date, as guaranteed by Spain and then later Mexico. But a big challenge is that the boundary of the Hopi territory was very vague in Spanish records, and there was never, or there is no record of, that we could find or that any of the experts we talked to knew of a specific Hopi land grant. And that is different than the Pueblos in New Mexico with clear land grants. So the adjudication is, and the denial of Hopi rights to the LCR is probably the biggest threat articulated by Hopi interviewees. And as culturally problematic as Western water rights are, they are really still the main mechanism for control and sovereignty in the current system of water management. And so Hopi interviewees' fear is that if the Hopi tribe is denied any rights to the LCR, then they won't have a place at the table to advocate for Sipapuni. And the fear is exacerbated by the fact that every other party in the adjudication, including the city of Flagstaff, where I live, are against Hopi having a right to the LCR outside their current reservation boundaries. So that includes to the main stem of the LCR and also to the lower gorge. So Hopi interviews basically conflate a denial of those water rights to the LCR with Sipapuni's death. And since the adjudication is focused on consumptive uses, the court has not considered unquantifiable cultural waters, such as a right for the waters for Sipapuni, even though the Hopi tribe made a claim in the adjudication for those purposes, for cultural in-stream flows in the lower gorge. They're not considered. They're not being considered in the court case. So kind of digging down one layer deeper, from that investigation, we realized that if the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo could be used for Hopi water rights, it seems like the most viable strategy is in first appealing a 1976 settlement by the Indian Claims Commission, which is really what's directing the current LCR court decisions. And in this settlement, which is known as Docket 196, again, if the Zoom is blocking the top title, it says 1976 Indian Claims Commission. So the settlement known as Docket 196 is when the Hopi tribe received $5 million from the US in payment for 4 million acres of lost lands. And the court's argument is that the ostensible acceptance of this settlement extinguished Aboriginal water claims, and thus the Hopi tribe is only entitled to claims within present-day reservation boundaries. However, digging back deeper into that history, the Docket 196 is a really well-documented incident of neocolonialism in which an illegitimate Hopi tribal council intentionally misrepresented Hopi villages. And furthermore, future Hopi tribal councils up to present day never accepted the money for fear that it would legitimize a technical sale of Aboriginal title. And so whether the settlement amounted to a technical sale of land or not is actually a vague and remaining legal question, and one that leaves the door open to whether Aboriginal title was ever extinguished. And so as it stands in the courts, as I've said, the Hopi do not have rights to the main stem of the LCR. And this really exacerbates concerns about the future of Sipapu. But at the same time, based on court precedent at this point, the Claims Commission extinguishment ruling is highly unlikely to be overturned. And the short of it is that the $5 million settlement, which today is valued, I think, at about $45 million, arguably was and remains illegitimate, but it still determines the present day LCR adjudication. for the Hopi. And so it appears to me that the Hopi tribe have already tried to argue for time immemorial under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo rights and boundaries, but the argument has been consistently rejected, and it seems unlikely to be decided differently within the Superior Court, because that would be considered a horizontal appeal. So the point of this is that there's a real need for legal scholars to further assess whether the treaty or challenging docket 196 continue to be viable or should be appealed to higher courts. And I wanted to just give a little more visual for how, and context for this docket 196 issue, and how Hopi land boundaries have changed since the original docket 196, and point out that Aboriginal lands identified by the Indian Claims Commission always bordered the Little Colorado River. Let me get my mouse over there. Okay. Oh boy, there it is. So up on this left-hand upper image, the original land area claimed, and if you can't quite see it, this is the Arizona-Utah border, and this is the Arizona-New Mexico border. So this is really the Little Colorado River, is this southwestern boundary. So the original claim in docket 196 in the initial submission, and amended in 1961, so this boundary was pushed westward, making it a little smaller. And then if we go down here, this is what, out of that larger area, this gray area is what was definitively adjudicated as the Hopi Aboriginal land area in 1970. And that's what this colored map is kind of zoomed in on. And we can see that Hopi Aboriginal land is, one of the boundaries is made up by the Little Colorado River. And then moving into this last image, in case it's not clear, what the Indian Claims Commission decision is trying to determine is basically how much land was lost to when the U.S. came in and took this land, and therefore how much money needs to be paid in this commission settlement, which again, vast majority of Hopi were against. And so this original shape here, the lighter gray, is determined to be the Aboriginal territory, and what was taken away when this box rectangle was formed, which is the 1882 executive order land. And then further from that, we'll get into this a little more in the next slide. This final little shape is something known as District 6. And so, I mean, just generally you can see the shrinking nature of what was considered Aboriginal lands, and also that those Aboriginal lands bordered the LCR. And I can't get my mouse back over there. There we go. Okay, last little pieces of detail here. So this image is a kind of zoomed in, and I just wanted to clarify for people, how complicated this water rights settlement is, and why it kind of is where it is now. So this box is that 1882 executive order area, and that rectangle was ordered for use for Hopi, and then quoting from the order, it says, "Other Indians, as the Secretary of the Interior may see fit to settle thereupon." And what that came to include, of course, were Dene people who were living there already. And then, so that set the stage for what became known as the joint use area, which is this. And then that was partitioned. between Navajo and Hopi. And so this is all to say that when the water rights claims are getting differentiated, the Hopi have a bunch of different dates. I don't know if you can't see that top date, but for this generalized green area, they have an 1882 water right date. And this small kind of pie shape is the only area that Hopi have time immemorial water rights claims in this area known as District 6. And so there's just, what I want to show is the constriction over time of what was considered to be Hopi territory and how that impacts current water rights. So right now this is 1882 time immemorial, and then this is Moenkopi Island that was added later in 1934. All right, so finishing up, I think, to be clear, just the purported sale of Aboriginal lands extinguished the Hopi tribe's Aboriginal title, which is what the Commission has determined in this docket 196, and that therefore terminated any water rights claims. And that's kind of why we are where we are today. All right, in conclusion, this research is fundamentally about the sacredness of water. And while the details of protection pathways for the confluence in Sipapuni are many, the salient finding is that the struggle for water protection in the Little Colorado River Basin is really the struggle for inherent Indigenous rights. And any research of how to protect Sipapuni, the confluence, and LCR must examine if and how such efforts either continue or challenge the colonial legacy of severing Indigenous people from their homelands and culture. A comprehensive anti-colonial protection pathway could start with deconstructing colonial mentalities by recognizing Indigenous knowledges as equal to Western science, then build collaborative and inclusive decision-making processes that prioritize Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Next, recognize Indigenous rights to land and water are inherent, while understanding advocacy strategies must also adapt colonial policies to achieve anti-colonial ends. And finally, progressing toward repatriation of Indigenous land. And ultimately, the policies we examined here have real limitations. Moving forward, particularly in light of multiple ongoing threats to the LCR, including dams, we are exploring anti-colonial analyses of other federal policies, such as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and co-management strategies that can be layered alongside existing designations to bring greater protection. So I continue to work with Black Mesa Trust in their ongoing efforts to protect Sipapuni and water in the LCR. Right now, we're involved in the permit revision process currently underway with Kayenta Mine, really advocating for adequate groundwater studies to be conducted, and that groundwater reclamation is a priority in Peabody's reclamation of both Kayenta and Black Mesa mines. And I saw Vernon Masayespa this morning, and he said something that I just really love, which is, he said, because we are made of water, we have power. And this is good because there's a lot of work to be done. And in Vernon's words, we're getting ready for a long haul. And that's the end. So those are just some select references, but please ask some good hard questions. Love to hear them.
Thank you, Rachel and Danielle. This is great for the work that you're doing, especially with Vernon. We wanted to make sure we have time for Q&A. So if you have a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question.
And I just want to leave this slide up, which is kind of ongoing future explorations. But I can go back to any slide.
Okay, I'll go ahead and lead the dialogue here with the question
Okay.
from myself while others are getting the courage to ask a question. So I was interested in how you, the process in working with Vernon Masayesva in doing this important research. Could you talk about the partnership building and the trust in working with the Black Mesa Trusts?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's it's such a huge component of this kind of research, and sometimes it's almost invisible, and it's really important to, I think, talk about it explicitly. And so, you know, this is a relationship that, as Denielle mentioned, kind of started with Denielle at the um, symposium, and then she brought me into the fold. And originally how it started, I was working with some undergraduate students who were in a program that was kind of connecting Northern Arizona University with community needs. And so that was the foundation of that relationship, working to help address Vernon's questions with the research capacity of myself and these students. And I think for me, there's so much learning and intentionality that we put into building a relationship that really prioritized what Black Mesa Trust needed and wanted versus any of our, like having a research agenda of my own. That was not the priority. And so there's a lot of things that we've investigated that aren't represented here. And I think at the beginning that built that relationship. And then there were other things like having a number of these interviewees we had meals with. They came to my classroom, they came to my house. Vernon and his wife Becky have invited me to their house, and so there's a lot of that I think just develops a sense of trust over time. So I could probably go on and on about that, but it's almost like a very clear moral orientation from the beginning, because there's not a good history between academia and Indigenous communities, and I think it has to be done very intentionally.
Thank you, Rachel. We have a question from Donna. Are there other Indigenous lens research within the Hopi and or Navajo that you know of?
Indigenous-led research within both either tribes? Yeah, absolutely. There's a ton. There are, I mean, we kind of focus mostly on grassroots groups and their work, but there's Indigenous-led research on water, particularly groundwater contamination, which is some of the other articles in the special issue around arsenic and uranium contamination. There's Hopi-led research for cultural resource management. For instance, all the cultural resources that have been impacted by the mining. So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Some of which NAU facilitates, some of which is independent. Dene College also facilitates Dene-led research.
Thank you, Rachel. We have some comments in the chat box saying that they enjoyed this excellent presentation, and also people wanting to share the webinars with others. This webinar is recorded and will be posted on the Superfund research page, so we'll send a link to the group afterwards. Another question is, have you done any exploration into the relationship between the impacts of the Bennett freeze on both the development of the Navajo water rights and access and the situation you describe with access to water rights by the Hopi tribe?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a lot there. There's a lot of context there. And I know not everybody, perhaps who's listening, is based in the Southwest. And so the Bennett freeze was a zone that was basically prevented from having any kind of development on it. I think until 2012, is that when Obama technically lifted the freeze. And I don't know how that has impacted the determination of water rights, but it has definitively impacted the access to water, because development was not allowed, and that particularly impacted the western chapters of the Navajo Nation.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. So
Okay.
we have like 3 minutes left. So one question is, are you aware of any particular projects that seek to understand ambiguous baseline data concerning the confluence?
Ambiguous, like water baseline data?
I believe so. That was all the question said.
Okay. Yes and no. So the groundwater at Black Mesa does have a long history of being studied by the Office of Surface Mining, which regulates Peabody, Western Coal Company, and then Peabody itself has conducted studies. There's a real lack of independent studies of groundwater in that region. However, the National Resource Defense Council did an independent study of that groundwater, specifically under the mines, and the USGS has an ongoing Black Mesa water monitoring program that's probably got the best baseline data over time, measuring differences in groundwater levels and spring output. But in terms of baseline data for spring changes in the lower gorge of the Little Colorado River, it's minimal. The USGS does work there primarily with endangered fish species. But as I mentioned in the presentation, there isn't baseline data on, for instance, the water output of Sipapuni. And there's discrepancy there in what is culturally appropriate to monitor and what is not. And so we are moving kind of along with Grand Canyon Trust and some hydrologists at the University of New Mexico to explore the feasibility of doing some spring monitoring in those lower springs in the Grand Canyon.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to conclude with one comment that Sharon Magdal would like to make as we end this webinar.
Thank you, Carletta. This is Sharon Magdal, Director of the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center. And I'll be very brief. One, I'd like to congratulate you, Rachel, for an excellent study and an excellent presentation and slides, very informative and educational. But I'd also like to note, refer back to one of the comments you made very late when you were almost at the end there, and you talked about going into each other's homes and sharing meals. And I want to note that I've been working quite a lot in different areas of the world and also here where people are working in binational settings, different cultures. And what so many people say is very important to eat with your partners. And that's one of the things we're having trouble doing now in the COVID-19 environment. So let's hope that we can get back to being able to forge the relationships that we can in person. And again, congratulations on a great presentation.
Thank you so much Sharon. For that comment. Yeah, it is incredibly important. Thankfully, that research was done prior to COVID, so.
Thank you, Rachel and Danielle, for this excellent presentation. And I invite all the attendees here to join us at the next webinar, which will be June 17th at 2 p.m. We'll be focusing on dissolved uranium and arsenic in unregulated groundwater sources on the Western Navajo Nation by Lindsay Jones, Jonathan Credo, and Jani Ingram. So please check out this webinar recording at the Superfund Arizona website. Thank you very much and have an excellent day.
Thank you so much, Carletta. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Cara. Are you gonna shut the meeting down?
I'm going to give people just a couple of seconds because I uploaded some flyers in the chat, and I also uploaded some links in the chat. So I want people to be able to copy the links for our CALS extension and the Superfund research site. And then I also want people to be able to download the flyer for the next webinar series posts. And Carletta is also co-hosting the Indigenous Co-Innovation in Food, Energy, Water Systems workshop next week. So I popped that flyer up in as well.
All right.
Yeah.
A lot of things. Do you want me to share the screen back with you?
Oh, I have nothing to share.
Okay. No, I'll pause my screen share.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for troubleshooting before.
Yeah. Thanks for being there. My goodness.
Thank you.
I was really grateful that we had that initial 30 minutes.
Yeah, that was wonderful. All right.
Okay. Well, I will sign off.
Good to meet you. Take care.
Take
Hi,
care.
Rachel. Oh, Rachel, one question. Do you mind if we post a PDF version of your talk with the video?
I don't mind. One of the issues of the PDF that I noticed that I sent you is it doesn't display all the images correctly because there's like animations that are layered in there.
Oh, I see.
Is there a way to post it just as a PowerPoint?
I think so. Do you mind if I rearrange your PowerPoint a little bit to display all the information and then convert it into a PDF?
That's fine. Yeah, if PDF is the way to go.
Yeah,
I'm afraid that might be tedious. But there's only really one slide I noticed. It's well, we can walk through together if you want, but let's see. It's the 7 slides. Well, now that Carletta's staying there, it's the slide after research questions. So anyway, we can work on that if you want. Okay. Bo, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I'm trying to pull out the presentation you sent me.
Okay. Yeah, there's like these bonus slides that I had at the end, like after all the presentation.
Yes.
Those don't necessarily need to be included.
So it's mostly the 7th slide you said?
I think so. Let's look. Or I can pull it. Oh boy.
My computer is really slow.
Well, and these PDF files are like so big. There we go.
Oh, I see.
I'm going to open up the PDF that I shared with you and see